Right, thank you, Lang. I appreciate the invitation to speak to the other side of the world here about a subject that's pretty near and dear not only to my professional practice, but something that I enjoy quite a bit as well. I understand not everybody is excited about some of the numbers and the hybrid of accounting and financial with environmental. But if you're on the call, maybe you are too. So I look forward to giving you an overview of some of my experience and hopefully get through this and have some time for some questions to have a conversation about some of these subjects. And if I'm not speaking loud enough or you're not hearing me or there's a problem, please do whatever you can to let me know because I'm very far away. Thank you. So before I get into it here, Geosyntec, as a policy of our company, we always start with the safety minute. And so we're not talking about going out in the field and standing behind dump trucks and doing hazardous chemical work here, but we all sit at desks. And I can say from looking at the safety statistics within Geosyntec that sometimes the ergonomics issues are the things that are some of the more reportable incidents, since it's something that many of us do. So just take a minute here to think about next time you're sitting at a desk for a long period of time, how you're sitting, and what you can maybe be doing to improve your working positions so as to minimize the wear and tear on your body and make yourself more comfortable and avoid long-term repetitive injuries for yourself. But with that, we'll move into the subject matter here. I'll start with just a brief introduction. Some of you probably know about Geosyntec. I've got one slide on Geosyntec here, so don't worry. It's not too much here. But Geosyntec Consultants, we're a multidisciplinary environmental consulting firm. We've got about 1,300 practitioners around the world in 60 or so offices. Seems to be increasing all the time. We're primarily, most of those offices are in North America, but we have offices in Australia, Malaysia, Canada, UK, and Ireland. And in Australia, we've got offices in Sydney, Perth, and Melbourne. We also work through a joint venture that Geosyntec has been involved with for a number of years called CAT Alliance Limited, which is a UK-based joint venture with 2 other European firms and as well as several partners around the world. And this partnership allows us to have, we like to say, boots on the ground around the world in more than 50 different countries, people that speak the languages, understand the current regulations. And I can tell you from my practice that's been a great asset to be able to pull somebody in that knows what it's going to take to actually address the site and can review the documents and give me the context that's necessary. Because even though the technical facts are often the same, the context and the regulatory bits are always different. Moving on, this is me. I'm saying hello from Washington, D.C. area in the U.S. I'm a chemical engineer. An environmental engineer by training, although I don't do a whole lot of that anymore. I've been doing this for about 22 years. And right now my practice focuses on, around the title of this presentation, Environmental Liability, Valuation, ELV, which we'll talk about more specifically later, as well as more generally what within Geosyntec we term our environmental management practice, which covers more broadly environmental due diligence, programmatic compliance, and some of the more programmatic and business sides of environmental consulting. In my career, I've been fortunate enough to look at many, many sites all around the U.S. and some around the world, including some in Australia, at least on paper. I've not had the joy of visiting yet. But it's been a wide range of sites, dealing with a whole sort of a lot of different things, things from large mine operations that stood at the bottom of open pit copper mines, and power stations, oil refineries, and very small manufacturing plants and everything in between. And through that, it's been a great asset for the practice that we have within Geosyntec, which focuses on understanding what it's going to take to remediate those types of sites. So, my hope today is to give you a little taste of what the environmental liability valuation practice looks like, some of the trends we see in the industry, and the like. More specifically, the topics that I'll cover today are a bit of the background, what we're talking about, what I mean when I talk about ELV, why we think it's important, talking about some of the requirements and guidance that are out there related to putting dollars and cents on environmental liabilities, talk about some of the approaches and tools that can be used, as well as some of the key challenges. It's a complex discussion usually when you get into a complicated remediation site and understanding what it's going to cost to address it in the long term. But there really are a couple things. In some cases, you'll see relatively simple things that I like to say move the needle, are the things that really drive the bottom line costs of some of those sites when you develop them. Then I'll finish off, talk about some trends and observations about where this practice seems to be going, and then hopefully have enough time for questions and discussion as we round out the hour here. Starting with some background, and I'll start with the U.S. here, and what you see here is a slide with a lot of big dollar signs on it. Hundreds of millions, billions of dollars that industry in the U.S. and around the world to some extent is having to face related to environmental liabilities. In some cases, this is because of ways how it's changed how we look at these environmental liabilities, whereas you may not have focused on wanting to quantify a life cycle cost in the 10, 20 years ago. You may be required to do that for various purposes, or because there's a lawsuit that says you should have. The financial reporting requirements are evolving. When environmental liabilities move the stock price of a company, lawsuits have come out of that, and that's where some of these large settlements have come from. I can say I was relatively deeply involved in the Tronox bankruptcy, which resulted in the largest environmental settlement in the U.S. in history, $5.15 billion U.S. a couple of years ago. And these sorts of numbers get attention and sort of raise the focus on why you should maybe spend a little bit more time up front to understand these costs for various purposes. I'll say I'm certainly not an expert in Australian environmental industry or regulation, but I did, as I should have, some research in advance of this presentation here. And I noted a number of different things that I'll touch on through the presentation here. One of them related to the context is at least these two government-funded environmental-focused or partially environmental-focused agencies within Australia. Over the course of about 20 years, the difference in 1992, there was an estimate that there was about 10,000 potentially contaminated sites around Australia. And looking in 2013, another estimate from another group said they believe there's 160,000 potentially contaminated sites. So this is, I think, an example. Maybe I'm taking this out of context, and I'd be interested to hear about that. But it's an example of the sort of the increased consciousness of the fact that there are environmental sites out there and that they may need to be dealt with someday. And even though some of these dates from a long, long time ago, long before there were environmental regulations, and related to what at the time were perfectly accepted industry practices that nonetheless today or in the future somebody may need to assess, investigate, and remediate those sites to meet current requirements and to protect public health and the environment. So I thought that was interesting, and that, you know, if you look at the way things evolved in the U.S., it's not that different, and I think we see a lot of parallels. So moving forward, we'll talk about ELV, my favorite subject, my favorite acronym. What I mean by ELV is simply an estimate that's developed for a specific purpose to quantify the cost to address an environmental condition. That's like a super generic definition, but it's necessary because you might be doing an environmental liability valuation for many, many different reasons. Everything ranging from financial disclosure required by accounting bodies and companies and countries, to litigation, to the need just to manage a portfolio of sites that a company may have. So there's procuring insurance is another reason. So there's lots of different reasons, lots of different contexts why you may need to be doing a valuation of your environmental liabilities. So with that, I'm often asked the question, you know, how much is it going to cost to clean this up? And the answer is usually not a point, you know, single point estimate. So I showed this slide as an example, and it's probably oversimplified and overcomplicated at the same time. But what you look at here is the range of possible future outcomes related to an environmental remediation project. And this is sort of like a log normal type curve here, which we find is actually fairly representative of environmental outcome distributions on these sorts of things. Usually your high-end cost risk is higher than your low-end cost risk. But because we're dealing with predicting the future here, we have to understand that there's uncertainty inherent in such an estimate. And when you talk about that uncertainty, there's lots of different ways that you can look at that. I mean, if you're a statistician versus if you're an accountant versus if you're an environmental professional, or if you try to do all of those things, there's lots of different words and terminology you use, like most likely, expected values, possible, probable, remote, materiality, and things like that, that all enter into it what cost you're looking for. So any cost in that light blue on that slide is arguably a correct number, but which number you want to pull off of a curve like that depends on why you're doing it, and what information you have and other things. I'll get more into that a little bit later, but for now, you know, I like to talk about the question of whose job is it to put a dollar amount on an environmental liability, and the answer is, you know, lots of different people do it. I like to do it. You know, it's part of my practice, but I recognize that there's a wide suite of people that need to and do put dollars on environmental liabilities. Every client, every person that wants to do one, I'm not going to say needs to call an experienced environmental consultant to do that for them. I typically would get called on things that are more complex, things that really are material to the bottom line of a deal or a business decision. If you're doing a $1 billion deal and the environmental liabilities, you don't care if there are 100,000 or 200,000 or $1 million. That's not material to the bottom line. You don't need an expert on environmental issues in that case, maybe. If it's a bigger piece of the puzzle, maybe you do. This is just a little bit more about what the types of analyses under the umbrella of environmental liability valuation that we do. There's analyses associated with litigation support for in-house counsel, for outside counsel that we've worked for, insurance analysis, both on the underwriting side, so helping clients and insurers and insured to understand the value of a liability when insurance is being originated, as well as when claims are being made, financial reporting, which I'll touch in more detail later. Property transactions is a big place where we see it quite a bit there. That's a picture there of the Washington Nationals baseball stadium that I did an interesting ELV project on to understand the effect of environmental liabilities on some property that was taken right under home plate to build that stadium. And we also do it simply just to manage a bunch of sites. Many of our clients have portfolios of sites that may have environmental issues with them, and they have a limited amount of dollars to spend on addressing them. And so prioritization and efficiently addressing those, an ELV type analysis can support that. We see it quite a bit in the U.S. when financial assurance mechanisms are required. You have a landfill, for example, that needs to be closed, and the regulatory authorities want to make sure that you have money available to do that if your company is no longer able to do so. So financial assurance mechanisms are required, and you need a basis for quantifying the amount of financial assurance that's required. And then lastly on this, I mean, we look at how to value resources. It's not always looking at liabilities, but sometimes you're valuing environmental assets. And I think that's a lot of fun when we do that. So, you know, what's the value of removing a ton of carbon dioxide from the environment? What's the value of preserving an acre or a hectare of wetlands in a wetland bank? And things like that. So this is getting more to life cycle costing sort of concepts, and some of the same techniques apply when you're looking at assets and liabilities. Moving forward to requirements and guidance, and I'll go through this quickly here. In the U.S., we have lots of guidelines. These are touching upon accounting requirements, which I'll get into here in a bit. I see there's parallels in Australia, certainly. We also have a good amount of, technical guidance on the proper way to do environmental liability estimates for different purposes from the U.S. EPA. We also see it from many of the state regulatory agencies here. We see it from international standards bodies like ASTM, which I'll talk about quite a bit here in a minute. And we see it from other agencies and other organizations that focus on the costing aspects of remediation and even more broadly construction projects. There are a lot of, even if you just look at a snapshot of accounting requirements in the U.S., there are a lot of them. And even though I'm not an accountant, I do work with lots of people who are accountants, and it's really helpful when someone like me who's asked to put dollars and cents on projects understands at least the basics, the fundamentals of what's driving the need for these estimates, and it's different depending on what kind of estimates you're looking at. And I see there are parallels in the Australian world as well. So to talk about that, again, caveat that I'm not an expert in Australian accounting or financial reporting requirements. What I do see is in 1998, it looks like there were some changes, Section 299(1)(f) of the Corporation Act, which specifically requires companies to report on their environmental performance. As I did my research, I actually looked on some interesting tangents on that, where this was referred back and forth, and went to a parliamentary review board, it looks like, who actually recommended the deletion of this requirement. But I do see that it's still on the books. It still is a requirement, so I guess that didn't take. And I also noticed that the Australian Stock Exchange a couple of years ago came out with a revised guidelines that included recommending the disclosure the reporting of material environmental they refer to economic, environmental, and social sustainability risks. So this is a parallel to what we've seen in the U.S. Certainly, and it also, getting to the next slide here, I think it's maybe a little bit parallel, a little bit lagging slightly behind, but the International Accounting Standards, which focus on these requirements. The International Accounting Standards Board has what's called IAS 37, which was issued in 1998, and I see that the Australian Accounting Standards Board issued Standard 137 in 2004. And although I have not done a very deep critical review of the two of them compared to one another, I do see that it looks like the AASB Standard 137, it basically builds upon the IAS 37, actually adds some more clarification and some more guidelines into that reporting requirement. So reporting requirements aside, there are other guidelines, the international guidelines that are out there that are often looked to as a baseline, as a framework, as a guidelines for how to do environmental cost estimates. The AACE, I'll mention the second one first, the Association for the Advancement of Cost Estimating, actually has what they call the Total Cost Management Framework, which is a very robust, large set of documents and standards, primarily focused on large capital projects, large construction projects, although I have seen them applied to environmental remediation projects. I will say the one that I often hang my hat on is the ASTM International Standard E2137, which is the standard that focuses on, the title of it here somewhere, but it's guidelines for environmental cost estimates, basically. And you can see that was last updated in 2011, and it's actually in the process of being not reauthorized because there are significant revisions that are being recommended. I'm on the working group that's working on this, and there are some changes to this. So anybody who uses this or refers to this is I'd be happy to talk to you about some of the changes that I see people proposing to this. I don't know if they'll get through final balloting, but there's likely going to become a bit more robust than it is now. And with that, I do want to talk about the ASTM standard more, because I do find that it's a good basis for doing any environmental liability valuation. But before I do that, I'll throw out there the question that I get asked a lot, which is, what's the right way to value an environmental liability? And I guess fortunately for my practice and my career, the answer is there isn't a right way. It really depends on why you're doing it, what information you have, what the needs of the estimate are, what the acceptable uncertainty and other things are, and who's going to use it and things like that. So we'll touch upon a little bit more of that a little bit later, and I do want to move into talking about the guidelines. There are a number of guidelines out there that I've mentioned already. The ASTM one, I think, it's not if you've looked at it before, you will see it's not a cookbook. It doesn't say step A through Z of how you do an environmental liability estimate, but it gives a strong framework, which I've found to be defensible under cross-examination and litigation, that is a good basis for any estimate you do, from the most simple to the most complex. It really fits into it pretty well. So this ASTM standard, as I said, is a general framework. It's appropriate for really any estimate, and it is defensible. I've brought it up and been, as I said, cross-examined on it in deposition before, and I think it holds up pretty well, but it doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. I also find that it is not, even in the U.S., it is not widely used, although it is becoming more and more prevalent. I'm seeing it pop up in other people's projects. I'm seeing it referenced more, but it is still, I wouldn't call it an industry standard. There really is no industry standard for environmental liability valuation, other than you need somebody qualified to be doing the estimate for you. And I will mention that ASTM also has a separate standard, which confusingly enough is E2173 instead of 2137, and that focuses on environmental disclosure requirements and guidelines for doing that. And I believe that one is next in the queue for review and update after they finish 2137. ASTM, I say it's a good framework because it boils things down onto the thing that you have to be considering in any type of estimate that you do. The key pieces being what information do you have available to you, what costs are going to be included in your estimate, what approach, there are many different approaches you can use, what sort of level of uncertainty is acceptable, some of these other assumptions, how you deal with contingencies, net present value, are you looking at allocation offsets or recoveries from other parties, and then simply how are you going to document it? Because there are various different ways, from a simple table to very complicated reports that get into your methodology and framework for doing it. So it's important that all those things be documented. This is an expansion of a table that's in the ASTM standard, which lays out the different costing approaches, the hierarchy of costing approaches. The current version doesn't necessarily say one is better than the other, but by putting the ones at the top, it says they're more robust and that they're, although not right for every circumstances, you should try to use ones that are higher on the figure than the others. That's something I've heard debated before. But at the top, you have a quoted price, whereas if you go and you get someone to give you a quote to clean up your site and they guarantee it and they buy insurance to back it up and they take the liability from you to the extent that is possible, then maybe that's a quoted price. That's, I think, difficult to come by in the environmental world, especially with the insurance market where it is. At the other end, in some cases, no estimate's appropriate. You don't have enough information. An estimate is just going to be is going to complicate the issue. And there have been some cases where somebody's come to me and I said, it's not appropriate to do an estimate yet. In between, you can look at what do I know I'm going to have to spend in the short term, a known minimum value. Often those are used in U.S. financial reporting requirements because the rules allow for it. You can look at a most likely a value saying, based on my professional knowledge, I've seen lots of sites like this, I think here's what the cost is going to be and here's my basis for that. Often that is hand in hand with a range of values. You could say, based on the high end and low end assumptions, here's the range. Expected values are becoming more and more prevalent, as I'll mention a bit later. And this factors in multiple possible outcomes and the probability of each one, and that can range from simple weighted averages to more complicated stochastic costing models, decision tree, and simulation type simulations. And those have their use as well, although they're not, I wouldn't do them for every single project. And we use lots of different tools for doing these estimates, from spreadsheets, sometimes it's back of the envelope calculation, to more robust statistical software. The ones we use typically are called At Risk and Crystal Ball, nicely named Crystal Ball, which have tools built in them to allow for pretty rapid and repeatable, I think, and customizable Monte Carlo type simulations and other sort of modeling and sensitivity analysis and the like. Data comes from all sorts of different sources. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of comprehensive sources of unit costs out there. There are some unit cost books are out there. Some government agencies have done some things. Often you're dealing with institutional knowledge and maybe more smaller subsets of data that may be available. Let's see. So with that sort of baseline for the way that we do estimates, I'll touch upon what I've seen are some of the key challenges in doing liability valuation analyses. This is my weed picture here. You can't help getting into the weeds. It's just a matter of how deep you get when you do a liability estimate like this. And you can really do a lot of harm getting too far in the weeds. You're going to, at best, waste time and money doing the estimate, and at worst, really obscure the usefulness of the results that you get out of an analysis. There's the whole garbage in leads to garbage out saying that I hear quite a bit. And you can build the most complicated models, and if it's not based on something reliable and reasonable assumptions based on actual data, it may look pretty, it may have all sorts of charts and just probability distributions, but it's really no more useful than maybe someone who knows sites similar to that one that gives you their gut feel cost on something. In some cases, complicated analysis is appropriate. That's something to consider. There are a number of other things that I'll touch upon here. One is the simple question of what's included versus what's excluded from an estimate. We have to talk about uncertainty and probability, the basis for your unit cost, and then some really just purely mechanical things like how you deal with contingency, cost and scope contingency. Anybody that's ever had to dig a hole for a remediation project knows that usually you end up digging more than you maybe planned to do in the beginning. So you've got to factor that into your estimates, that knowledge and that likelihood. And then net present value, and then how we deal with cost allocation. And that's something that's a huge issue here in the U.S. So I'll try to go through these relatively quickly. From the where to draw the line for a liability estimate, this is another place that the ASTM standard comes in handy, and it has a nice little laundry list built right into the standard of the different things that can be included. This is something that the working group is actually looking to expand, hopefully not too much, and maybe categorize things a bit more. But it's really important. One of the first questions I usually ask when somebody says, I want to come up with an estimate of what it's going to cost to clean up this site, is to sit down and talk about what needs to be included in the estimate and what should not be included in the estimate. And sometimes that's based on the requirements. If you're doing it for different types of insurance analysis, certain things may be covered and certain things may not be covered. So you have to include and exclude things. If you're doing it for financial reporting requirements, maybe it's important to include certain things but not others. And if it's for litigation purposes, there's certainly, you want to define what's included and what's excluded. But knowing what that is avoids problems down the line when, maybe a client on my end would assume that things like compliance costs for permitting and stuff would be included, and I assumed that it wouldn't be. It's much better if you have that understanding from the beginning. Moving on to cost basis, any kind of environmental estimate has unit cost bases. When we look at these, sometimes those are at a very high level. You can say, well, here I did this at this site. I had to build this type of remediation at this site before, and I got to do it again, so I know what it costs. Those are your best case scenarios. You may have similar sites that you can draw data from. You may have a vendor that you trust that you can call to get quotes from and base things on that. Then after that, you get to publicly available sources, published unit cost sources, and then in some cases, it's just you come to someone like me and said, you've looked at lots of sites. What do you think it's going to cost here? What's your gut feel? What's your experience on this? All those are valid in the right context, but explaining your basis for your unit costs in any case, whatever you use, is important. And some very complicated analyses where I've had to do analyses of entire portfolios, and you're using some of all of these in your estimates, I've found that it's helpful to have a hierarchy that you work from. You can say, when I have the ones at the top, I use those, and then I work my way down the bottom until as needed to get the information that I need. Uncertainty and probability are dealt with in lots of different ways. It's much more than I can get into here in 1 minute on this, but let me just say that it's something that the estimator needs to understand. There has to be a common understanding between the user of the estimate and the person developing the estimate, because there are many, many different ways, everything from drawing a simple contingency on things, which in some cases is acceptable. In some cases you don't want any contingency, up to very complicated approaches, and I'm doing this on a project right now where you have sort of a congress of experts that get together and use a Delphi method approach, where you have a room full of experts to give their estimates and to work toward a common understanding of what the amount should be. I've only seen that on the one I'm working on now, one other project. That's a rarity, but that's sort of an extreme. Contingency is something that, if you've ever looked at an environmental estimate, you've probably seen different people use different contingencies. In some cases, nobody even thinks about it. It's 30%, 20%, 10%. If you're doing it in the U.S., for Superfund type sites, they use this plus 50 minus 30 number. If you dig into the literature, there are many different guidelines on what you should use out there. I wouldn't say there's a right way to do it. Just like many things in cost estimating, you just need to be consistent and to document what your assumptions are and why you did it. I don't think this is one of the areas where I've seen some of the biggest fights across the negotiating table over whether you should use 10% or 20% or 30%, and it's just something that you're never. I've never seen agreement on. It's always an agree to disagree, and you end up somewhere in the middle. But if you're arbitrary and inconsistent, it's not nearly as defensible as using consistent and well-documented assumptions regarding contingency. Now, I leave the sort of the best for last here in the mechanics, and net present value is something that in itself has nothing to do with environmental liabilities or environmental science or engineering. Often this drives the bottom line of cost estimates more than anything else. On this slide, I show just a very simple example of if you're spending $1 a year for 100 years, and depending on how you evaluate the net present value of that, the discount rate that you use, you can end up with just hugely different numbers of net present value. This is another thing that is hotly debated on a number of the different projects and circles that I work in, as to what the appropriate discount rate is. My answer to that is, like many things in this business, it depends on why you're doing it. It may be appropriate to use a very low, could be considered a risk-free rate if money needs to be put aside in case that the performing party is no longer there and somebody is left, the public is left holding the liability and needing to clean up the site. On the other hand, if you have a company that's well funded and can make money on the money that it has on its balance sheet by putting it to work in the business, it's arguably appropriate to use a higher discount rate based on the return on capital of a company, because if the company is going to be around, they can get returns on the money that they put aside to clean up the site in the future. Hotly debated. I won't get into it more than that, but I guess one more thing I'll mention is the concept of real versus nominal discount rates. Real being a rate that already has the inflation built into it, and the nominal is intended to discount already inflated cash flows. That's something I've seen some fairly impressive consultants on other fronts and not understand the difference between those things, and because a couple percentage difference in a discount rate can make a big dollar difference if you have a long-term O&M on a remediation. It's something that should be understood. I'll touch on allocation here just because it's been very relevant to my practice recently. In the U.S., we're dealing with a lot of multi-party sites, so usually sediment remediation sites, where there are dozens or even hundreds of parties that are at the table that may have a share of the remediation. This is becoming a very dynamic science within the U.S., and the different approaches for allocating costs to different parties at complicated sites. There is some good experience within the U.S., and there is some guidance. I'm not sure how much this has affected Australia or other places around the world, but it's something that really is coming to heads here in the U.S., and it's something that relatively few experts with a lot of experience in this are trying to figure out how to deal with this. And just like any cost estimate, there is no right way to do it. It has to be a well-founded and defensible approach to get it done. And I'll finish up and talk about some trends here. I know I've got about 15 minutes left. Hopefully get through this in 5 or 10 and leave some time for questions here. But this is a slide I like to use, and this is kind of the way that I think clients in the U.S. have looked at environmental consultants. And so these time frames may be different in Australia. They may be similar in Australia. I'm not sure. But initially, when pollution and environmental issues became prevalent and something that industry needed to deal with, it was focusing on the non-compliance piece. There's this new regulation, we need to deal with it, or I got a fine. How do you help me put something at the end of my pipe to fix it so I don't get a fine anymore? Once that, over 10 or so years, it moved into having a better understanding of the requirements and looking to proactively establish systems to comply with those permits that were going to be needed. And then even as time moved on, probably in about the 2000s time frame here in the U.S., an even more proactive approach started to become more prevalent in the concepts of looking at long-term liability, not just what do I need to do today, but how can I look at my requirements today and the future costs and make changes today to help manage those costs in the future. And then even more recently, and this is where I think where we are now, where the environmental aspects, which used to sort of be in their own separate column in any sort of business decision, are becoming integrated with the other business functions, the accounting, the legal, just the business operations and production. And when you integrate the environmental concepts into that, you can certainly see some benefits from it, and this is where the concepts of sustainability and life cycle costs and things like that come in, and I think that's where we are today and continuing to evolve. More specifically focused on the ELV, referring back to that ASTM chart there, the estimates are moving up in the figure, whereas no estimates were done in the past, or just how much am I going to have to spend next year. We're hearing more requests from our clients to, hey, can you help me understand the potential outcomes of this, to do expected value type estimates or to look at ranges of costs or upper end contingency costs. That's something that we hear more of every year, and that's being done for a number of different reasons. Sometimes the companies are forced to do that. Sometimes it's just an evolution of the way that environmental liabilities are looked at in different industries. I think it's a good thing. It's good for my practice, and I think it provides clarity on what these liabilities actually are. We're also seeing, as I mentioned before, not just looking at the liabilities themselves. If you look at an asset and a liability together, for example, a piece of property that has some contamination on it, by looking at it as an asset and a liability together and evaluating those things together, you can realize some benefit and some hopefully some profit. For example, the more maybe you clean up a site, the higher use it might have for a potential buyer. And so there is, in many cases, you can evaluate sort of that optimal cost-benefit analysis of cleaning up more versus the increase in potential property value associated with it. And we're also looking at the expansion of the black box, I'll call it, whereas including more and more in an estimate, not just looking at what does the investigation or remediation cost, but more aspects, tangential sorts of considerations are being incorporated into estimates that we do. And then we're also seeing, as I mentioned before, some of these more complicated, maybe not complicated, it's the wrong term, but call them useful, robust and useful business analytics like sensitivity analysis and modeling and stochastic modeling of environmental liabilities. We're seeing requests from clients. That's this next slide here, where a result of a relatively simple Monte Carlo simulation we ran, looking at a PRP share of a Superfund site in the United States that a company that wanted to buy the company that had liability there wanted to understand. And we looked at a number of different variables in sensitivity analysis on it. You see this as that log normal distribution, like I mentioned before, and helped them. They don't know exactly where the cost is going to come out, but they were able to get their arms around it to the extent that they were able to make an informed business decision about whether to buy the company. And then this is a much bigger topic here, but we're even applying even some more sophisticated analysis, things like real option theory, incorporating the concept that having the option to do something with a property actually has value, and that can be incorporated into some of these models. If you have a piece of property and you're not under an obligation to clean it up now, but you could, and potentially sell it now, or you can wait until it's required, there's a value in that, and so factoring that into an analysis in some cases can really help bring clarity to a business decision. And then we're also looking at, on a number of projects, separating out the time value of money from the risk associated with a project and looking at those separately. And in many cases on a financial analysis, you'll apply a discount rate which is intended to incorporate both of those things. For environmental estimates, we're finding you can have more clarity in some cases by separating those two things out. One example of on a number of projects, we've been asked to sort of simulate an insurance premium, so what we'll call a synthetic insurance premium for different purposes. And there's a number of people around Geosyntec that are really delving into this. This is not industry standard by any standpoint yet, but maybe the direction that things are going. We at Geosyntec like to be sort of pressing the envelope on these things here. I'll mention briefly that because I think we saw this in some of the literature that another use for these estimates that's becoming more and more useful is to basically do optimization analyses on active remediation systems. So, I mean, you can do that as is shown on this slide here to optimize sort of diminishing returns on remediation, pre-product LNAPL recovery. But when you build in the cost associated with that, shown on this next slide here, you can look at the cost-benefit analysis of that, of maintaining an ongoing remediation system, maybe versus changing to a passive or changing to a different type of remedy. And that's something that at Geosyntec we're often asked to do, and that brings people like me together with our remediation specialists to try to really have analyses that are not just based on numbers, but are based on a true understanding of the remediation science and technology. Lastly here, I mean, there are lots of other trends out there, which I will just touch on here, looking at estimating value of different types of natural resources that are out there. In the U.S., there's litigation focused on natural resource damage, which has been slow but continuing to grow. The evolution of environmental insurance products is something we're always watching. There were what's called cost cap insurance policies for a while, and then they sort of went away, and now we're just starting to see some of them come back in the industry, which I think some of our clients are very interested in. We're looking at the evolution of financial reporting requirements in the U.S. certainly, and then the international requirements as well. Those seems that there are often threats that those are going to change significantly that in the U.S. and then they don't. So we've had a couple of false starts on that for the past 10 years or so. Maybe they won't change, but if they do, it will have a significant impact on industry. And then lastly, and this is something I noted in Australia, that the class action lawsuits are a relatively new thing. Maybe I'm understanding it wrong, but it seems like this is something that in the 90s became allowable in Australia. In the U.S., class action lawsuits focus on toxic torts, property value, diminution, bodily injury type claims from exposure to chemicals are huge, have huge dollar amounts associated with them for many clients in the U.S. And that's something where these types of analyses on understanding the environmental liabilities can be applied as well, and so we've been pulled into a number of those projects as well. So with that, I've left a good old 4 minutes here for questions. I can stick around. It's already late for me, so my kids are already asleep. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has here, or I'll provide my contact information there. I'd be happy to follow up with anybody on the call. With that, I'm finished, Lang.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. I really appreciate a very interesting presentation, and of course, always appreciate the fact that you've stayed up late for us to accommodate our time zones over here, which are nearly the opposite planet. Do we have any questions from the group out there? Once again, you are welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question verbally. Just click the arrow next to your name and you'll have the option to unmute. Also, feel free to use public chat in the lower left-hand corner or the Q&A tool in the menu bar. I'll flag that we'll also follow up with an email, as we typically do with these presentations, that has our contact details, and of course, you know, if there's anything that comes to mind after the presentation that you'd be interested in some advice on, you're more than welcome to get in touch.
No question. Making it too easy.
It's all the financial stuff, you know, sort of environmental scientists here. You might have sent it flying over heads.
This stuff's a lot less complicated than the environmental stuff. But you got to know who's going to pay for things, or you can't actually get them addressed.
I've got one quick question, Mike. We, I think like the U.S. right now, perfluorinated chemicals are an emerging contaminant of concern, and, you know, we're only sort of just getting our heads around the regulation of these things at various sites. And I read an article in the New York Times recently about ongoing litigation with DuPont over, I guess it must be toxic tort type cases for a bunch of exposed communities. Just sort of an example of an application of an environmental liability that might come into play under the various areas you discussed?
Yes, I mean that's certainly something I'm sure, although I don't believe that we're doing it. I know I'm not doing it for DuPont. That they have consultants and attorneys, because this is with the toxic tort lawsuits, the attorneys need to look at the potential legal outcomes of the cases that often have nothing to do at all with the technical facts, as I find to be entertaining. But I mean, on that, you've got a number of fronts. You know, so you might look at what's the perfluorinated compounds are maybe in the groundwater or in the surface water. We don't even know how they're fully going to be regulated here. It sounds like it's the same there. So they have to be looking at potential outcomes for if it has to be cleaned up to different levels. We know the people
All
like
guests
people
have
at
been unmuted.
Are figuring out the best way to efficiently deal with it. So yes, I mean this is one where there's going to be huge levels of uncertainty with any sort of analysis that's done, and this may be a case in some aspects of it where you're just not far enough along to come up with a useful estimate. Otherwise, you're going to come up with a huge range of potential costs that might be frightening, and also just might not be based in very much science. So on something like this, you might just want to look at what do you know you have to do here in the short term, and that's the best that you can do. On the toxic tort side of things, I'm sure the lawyers who are involved are looking at potential outcomes from toxic tort lawsuits as well, but it's definitely a huge thing that I know is all over the financial reporting documents that come from DuPont.
Sure. We've got a question here from... go ahead.
I know if you have it. This is still reading in Malaysia.
Hello, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
This is Phil Reed.
Hey, Phil,
in Malaysia.
Hi, Phil. Yep, I can hear you.
Question for Mike. Hey, on a rough percentage basis, what's your experience with how many environmental due diligence assignments progress to an ELV exercise?
I would say that I mean to clarify that. So I mean we're often asked. I mean 100 times or so, plus or minus a year, Geosyntec asked to come in and do environmental due diligence support on a project. I'll say in the U.S. it's a very small percentage, except on the very big projects. You know, maybe 10%, just to throw that out there. Sometimes they just want a phase one report. Honestly, I'll admit I don't know the analog in Australia, but internationally, I find that it's often integrated, probably at least half of them, where the cost estimating piece of it is integrated right into the due diligence process and even built into the reports that are generated. So it really depends on where the client is. Part of the reason for that is the U.S. standard for the phase one environmental due diligence does not have the costs built into it. So to the extent those are included, they're typically included as a sort of a separate add-on, either as a informational memo, or sometimes those sorts of costs are just provided separately.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, there was a question from one of our attendees just in relation to the slide when you were talking about sort of contingency and uncertainty ranges for the various aspects. The question was, were the numbers that were put up on the screen, were they a minus to plus or a plus to plus? For example, minus 10 to plus 50 or plus 10 to plus 50?
Well, I don't see that question here, but it depends. I mean, in the U.S. for our Superfund sites, our largest sites that are being overseen by the U.S. EPA, it's plus 50, minus 30, and so you have a higher upper end risk than lower end risk in those cases. I mean, and that also is consistent with that log normal curve that you saw there, where there's more potential outcome to the right of the expected value than to the left of the expected value. In some cases, I see it's a plus and minus the same direction, plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 15%. I can't say that I've seen an example where you have a higher low end cost risk than you have a upper cost risk. So like a minus 20 plus 10. I don't think I've seen that before.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions out there?
Let's see. It looks like there's a couple more in here. So have we been involved with the estimation for sustainability arguments used for determining when remediation should cease? The answer is yes. When I talk about the we at Geosyntec, that's not something that I've focused on, but there are people, I know a number of people within Geosyntec that have focused just on that and incorporating the sustainability considerations into not only whether remediation should stop, but also in the remedy decision side of things. So in selecting what the appropriate remedial technology is. That's something that, at least in the U.S., that EPA has not officially blessed as including in remedy decision making, but we are seeing it brought into the discussion both on the ongoing systems and the remedy selection stage. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, do we have anyone else out there with a question for Mike while we've got him on the line? Again, you're more than welcome to send through an email afterwards if you think of something that doesn't come to mind right now. We'll follow up with everyone with contact details. But feel free to get in now if something pressing.
If you need me to come visit Australia, I'd be happy to come. We could probably do it over the phone. That works too. Great. Well, thank you for the invitation, Lang, and everybody thank you for joining, and hope to follow up with some of you soon.